Utah 2004. In the quiet mountain valley of Heber City, spring usually came gently. Meltwater threading down from the Wasatch Peaks, lawns greening, families prepping for summer fairs. But on one cold April morning, that peace broke apart. Emily Carter, 26, an elementary school art teacher known for her calm kindness and the way she painted sunsets that looked almost real, vanished without warning. 1 hour she was seen leaving a grocery store on Main Street, brown paper bags in her hands. The next, her silver 2002 Honda Civic sat abandoned at the Daniels Canyon trailhead, its driver's door unlocked, coffee cup still steaming faintly inside. Deputies from the Wasatch County Sheriff's Office arrived before noon. Nothing looked stolen. Her wallet, cell phone, a small flip-style Nokia Common then, sat on the passenger seat. The keys dangled from the ignition, but there was no sign of Emily. Within hours, the town rallied. Dozens of volunteers combed the canyon trails, aided by search and rescue teams and scent dogs. Helicopters from the Utah Highway Patrol flew low passes. Detectives documented every footprint, every tire mark. They found only faint impressions leading toward a wooded ridge that ended abruptly near a rocky slope. Detective Paul Madsen, who led the early search, later said, "It was like she walked into the trees and disappeared into thin air. No drag marks, no torn clothing, nothing." At first, police considered accident or abduction. The terrain was rugged. Mountain lions roamed nearby. But Emily was experienced outdoors and always told family where she was going. Her sister Rachel confirmed Emily had mentioned no weekend hiking plans. By Monday morning, local TV stations from Salt Lake City carried the story. Reporters interviewed tearful neighbors outside Emily's small rental house on Canyon Road. Her parents, James and Linda Carter, drove from Provo, pleading for information. Then came a brief glimmer of hope. A witness, a trucker passing through the canyon, reported seeing a woman matching Emily's description, walking along the shoulder around 10 a.m. Saturday. But dashcam footage from his rig's analog tape system was blurry and offered nothing. Definitive investigators traced Emily's final hours through store receipts and cell tower pings. Back then, triangulation data was rough, covering wide areas, but they managed to confirm her last call around 9:22 a.m. to her mother. It lasted less than a minute. She said she'd be home soon, Linda later recalled, and she sounded fine. The FBI joined briefly under the Highway Safe Trails Task Force, checking for links to interstate abductions. None fit. By early May, the search scaled down. The town's optimism thinned. Flyers hung limp on telephone poles, rain-spotted and fading. Detectives questioned co-workers, friends, and Emily's former boyfriend, Mark Jensen, who still lived nearby. He cooperated fully, turned over his 2001 Ford Ranger for forensic testing, and provided a buccal swab for DNA comparison. The state lab, then limited to STR, short tandem repeat analysis, found no trace of Emily in his vehicle. For months, leads trickled in. A reported sighting in Ogden, a tip from someone in Nevada. None checked out. By winter 2004, the case file thickened but clarity thinned. In January 2005, with no body, no weapon, and no suspect, the investigation officially entered inactive status. Emily's parents refused to let it die. They set up a small foundation to fund missing person awareness in Utah. Every April, they lit candles by the canyon trailhead. Locals still stopped to talk about that poor Carter girl. Years slipped by. Technology advanced. Around 2011, evidence from older cases began to be digitally re-examined as Utah's crime labs upgraded to newer DNA sequencing systems. Emily's file was quietly pulled, rebagged, and placed into long-term storage, its chain of custody logs signed by yet another detective who hadn't even been on the force when she vanished. No one then could have imagined that, nearly 2 decades later, The same small sample of touch DNA, barely a trace lifted from her car door handle, would finally speak, thanks to a technology not yet known to those 2004 investigators. The years that followed were quiet ones, the kind of quiet that sinks into a community until it becomes part of its rhythm. Heber City kept growing. New houses went up, traffic thickened, and children who once had Emily as their art teacher graduated and left town. But her name never disappeared entirely. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the faces of her parents who still drove up every month to meet with detectives, hoping something, anything, had changed. For most of the late 2000s, the file labeled Carter Emily Missing Person sat deep in the Wasatch County Sheriff's evidence room. Inside were dozens of reports, crime scene photos printed on glossy paper, interviews typed on fading letterheads, and a single plastic envelope containing swabs and fibers sealed in 2004 tape. In those years, Utah law enforcement began slowly modernizing its systems. Around 2008, the state's crime lab adopted the updated Combined DNA Index System, CODIS protocol, allowing for more sensitive comparisons of genetic profiles. Older cases were sometimes rechecked if any new evidence could yield results. Emily's wasn't one of them yet. The samples were too small, too degraded, and the priority went to homicides, not disappearances without a confirmed body. Still, one man didn't forget. Detective Paul Madsen, now promoted to lieutenant, carried the memory of that early spring search like unfinished business. In 2010, while reorganizing cold case archives, he requested that Emily's evidence boxes be re-inventoried and digitally logged. It was a small step, mostly paperwork, but it kept her case from vanishing entirely. In 2012, Utah began using newer YSTR DNA testing, focusing on paternal lines for potential identification. The state had already seen national headlines from cases solved decades later through this method. Madsen hoped it could help. But the sample from Emily's car handle yielded no full profile, only partial alleles, too few to be matched confidently. The Carters kept waiting. James Carter grew slower. Linda started walking with a cane. They still visited the canyon trail every spring, setting flowers by the signpost and writing her name in the dust of the trail marker. Then, a small shift came in 2015. The department hired a new detective, Samantha Ruiz, fresh from Salt Lake City PD. She was part of a younger generation of investigators, tech-savvy, analytical, patient with data. While reviewing cold cases as part of a statewide initiative, Ruiz came across Emily's file. Something about its simplicity struck her. There was no body, no major suspect, just absence. She reopened the file and started from the beginning. She found small things others had missed. Handwritten notes about a neighbor's truck parked near the trail that morning. A statement from a gas station clerk who mentioned seeing a man buying bleach later that day. At the time, none of it tied together. Ruiz contacted the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services, asking whether newer touch DNA recovery techniques, using improved extraction kits now available in the mid-2010s, could reprocess the original swabs. They agreed to test. It took months. Funding was tight, and the case was low priority. But in early 2016, a partial male DNA profile was finally recovered from one of the swabs taken off the car's interior door handle. It wasn't enough for a match in CODIS, but it was enough to preserve for later use. Ruiz logged the data and waited. By 2018, genealogy-based investigations were starting to change everything. The Golden State Killer arrest that year caught national attention, showing how publicly available genetic databases could identify suspects who'd escaped justice for decades. Ruiz watched that news closely. She knew the same could one day apply to Emily's case. But in 2018, Utah still didn't have statewide policies or budgets for forensic genealogy. Ruiz could only flag the file as a candidate for future analysis. It was a small note in a long report, but it would prove vital later. Around that time, a new development shook the Carter family. A hiker found a piece of clothing, a torn fabric scrap matching a light blue jacket Emily was last seen wearing, less than a mile from the original trailhead. Testing confirmed the fibers matched the jacket from police photos. It reignited public attention briefly. News outlets revisited the case. People speculated again, theories resurfaced, and old wounds reopened. Still, there was no suspect, no name, no closure. The partial DNA profile remained untouched. Waiting for technology and policy to catch up, Detective Ruiz stayed patient. In an interview years later, she said, "Back then all we could do was hold on to hope that someday the science would give us a way to speak for her. That someday would arrive." Quietly in 2021, when Utah's Attorney General authorized cold case units to use forensic genealogy through external labs in partnership with the FBI, what no one yet realized was that Emily's killer had never left. He'd built a life just 3 doors down from where she once lived, raising children, attending block parties, waving to neighbors who never suspected a thing. By 2021, the landscape of criminal investigation in Utah and across the country had changed forever. The word genealogy had taken on a new weight in law enforcement. What once belonged to family historians was now helping. Detective Samantha Ruiz knew this better than most. That spring, Utah's Attorney General's office rolled out new funding for cold case units, allowing certain unsolved files with viable DNA to be submitted to forensic genealogy labs. In partnership with the FBI and private contractors like Othram and Parabon Nanolabs, Ruiz didn't hesitate. Emily Carter's case was one of the first she nominated. Fiji. Partial DNA profile recovered from Emily's car years earlier was carefully packaged and sent to a certified lab for genetic genealogy analysis, a process that compared the unknown sample to publicly available genetic databases such as GED Match and Family Tree DNA, used only by individuals who had opted in for law enforcement comparison. The waiting began. Genetic genealogy wasn't instant. Analysts first had to build an extended family tree from distant matches, sometimes fourth cousins or further, and then work backward through census records, obituaries, and public archives to identify possible male relatives who fit the right age, location, and opportunity. By late 2022, Ruiz received the first preliminary report, a genetic network pointing to a cluster of families with roots in northern Utah, specifically around Wasatch and Summit counties. It wasn't a name yet, but it was a direction. For months, genealogists traced the branches, filtering through generations, separating old records from living descendants. Then, in early 2023, a potential line emerged, one that led startlingly close to home. The DNA pointed toward a male relative of the Gaines family, longtime residents of Heber City. Among them was Michael Gaines, a 52-year-old construction contractor, who in 2004 had lived just 3 houses down from Emily Carter. Ruiz stared at the name in disbelief. Gaines had never been interviewed as a suspect. He'd given a brief statement back in 2004, saying he'd seen nothing unusual that morning. He was a friendly face in the neighborhood, helped shovel driveways, fixed fences, coached Little League. There was nothing about him that had ever raised alarm. Now, almost 20 years later, the science was pointing straight at his family line. Investigators worked quietly. The Utah Bureau of Investigation joined the effort alongside the Wasatch County Sheriff's Office. Surveillance teams gathered fresh samples, items discarded by Gaines during his daily routine: a fast food cup, a cigarette butt, a coffee lid. Each item went to the state lab for comparison. In March 2023, the results came back. The DNA from those discarded items matched the partial male profile found on Emily's car door handle with overwhelming probability. The odds of coincidence were calculated at greater than 1 in 10 trillion. After nearly 2 decades, they finally had their suspect. Detective Ruiz prepared the case file for the district attorney. Warrants were obtained for both DNA confirmation and a formal arrest. Gaines was taken into custody without incident at his home on March 29, 2023. His wife and grown children stood stunned as deputies surrounded the property. Neighbors couldn't believe it. The man they'd known for years, the one who'd organized block barbecues, volunteered during flood season, and attended every local fundraiser, was suddenly accused of abducting and killing the young teacher who had once lived a few doors away. Under interrogation, Gaines initially denied everything. But as forensic analysts confirmed, the genetic link and investigators presented photographs of his truck, similar to one seen near the trailhead in 2004, his confidence began to falter. Ruiz later described that moment. He just went quiet. He didn't yell or argue. He sat there with his hands folded and stared at the table for a long time. Then he said, "You people never forget, do you?" When asked what happened that morning, Gaines gave a vague, broken version of events. He claimed he had offered Emily a ride when she pulled over by the trail, saying her car was acting strange. He said they argued about what he wouldn't say, and things got out of control. He maintained that her death was an accident, though he never said where her remains were. Forensic searches followed, combing new sections of Daniels Canyon. Ground-penetrating radar was used on several wooded areas, identified through cell tower data, and Gaines's past work sites. In June 2023, search teams uncovered human remains partially buried beneath shale rock, near an old service road, less than 2 miles from the original trailhead. Dental records confirmed what everyone had long feared. It was Emily Carter. The news spread through Utah like wildfire. Local TV channels aired archival footage from 2004, the old news interviews, the tearful pleas, the helicopter footage from the first searches. Now at last the headline changed. Utah cold case solved after 19 years. Genealogy links local man to missing teacher. Emily's parents, now in their 70s, stood quietly as Detective Ruiz delivered the news. There were no tears left, just quiet gratitude and the relief of an ending, however painful. But for the town of Heber City, the shock was only beginning, because for nearly 20 years, the killer had lived among them, waving from his front porch. The arrest of Michael Gaines shattered the quiet surface of Heber City. Within days, news vans lined Main Street. Reporters crowded outside the county courthouse, their microphones glinting under the high-altitude sun. A town that hadn't seen a major crime story in decades suddenly found itself at the center of national headlines. Gaines was charged with first-degree felony murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors chose not to pursue the death penalty. Utah law allowed it, but the Carter family requested life imprisonment instead. They didn't want another life taken in Emily's name. In early hearings, Gaines appeared calm. He wore glasses, a plain collared shirt, and kept his hands clasped on the defense table. The courtroom sketch showed a man who looked more like a retired teacher than a killer. His attorney argued that the DNA evidence only placed him in contact with Emily's car, not at the scene of a homicide. He called the genetic genealogy process circumstantial and invasive, but prosecutors were methodical. They presented the chain of evidence, the 2004 swabs, the preservation logs, the 2016 retesting, and finally, the genealogy work that led straight to his discarded cup in 2023. Each link was documented, photographed, and verified by multiple experts. The Utah State Crime Lab confirmed the match again using next-generation sequencing, a method increasingly accepted in forensic courts since 2020. Jurors listened as analysts explained how tiny traces of touch DNA could survive for years if sealed properly. The most haunting moment came when Detective Ruiz took the stand. She spoke softly, steady but emotional. She described pulling Emily's file from storage a decade earlier, rereading every line and refusing to close it again. "I promised her parents I'd keep trying," she said. "And I meant it." The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting contamination or coincidental contact from neighborhood interactions. But then came the map evidence. Investigators had reviewed old cell tower records and construction invoices from Gaines's company in 2004. They discovered that on the very morning Emily vanished, Gaines's phone pinged near Daniels Canyon, miles from his claimed worksite, and his truck's fuel purchase matched a timestamp from that same area. In July 2023, facing mounting evidence, Gaines abruptly changed his plea from not guilty to guilty of second-degree murder under a plea agreement. In a short statement read before the court, he admitted to an altercation that resulted in unintended death. He claimed panic led him to hide the body. He never gave full details. No clear motive emerged. No theft, no assault, no romantic involvement. Investigators believed it began as a chance encounter gone wrong. Perhaps she rejected in advance. Perhaps he lost control. The truth remained locked behind his guarded expression. During sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Emily's parents sat in the front row, holding a framed photo of their daughter, the same one used on the missing posters 19 years earlier. When the judge read the sentence, 25 years to life at the Utah State Prison, a hush fell over the room. Gaines showed no visible emotion. He only looked briefly toward Ruiz and said, almost inaudibly, "You were right." "You people never forget." Outside, reporters gathered around the Carters. Linda's voice trembled as she spoke. "It took nearly 20 years, but today we know. And knowing finally lets her rest." For Detective Ruiz, the victory was bittersweet. In interviews, she admitted the satisfaction was mixed with sorrow. "You work so long for a moment like this," she said, "but when it comes, it's not celebration, it's quiet. It's the kind of quiet that belongs to the families." After the sentencing, the Utah Attorney General publicly commended the case as one of the state's earliest full successes using forensic genealogy. It prompted new funding for cold case units statewide. Dozens of other dormant files were reopened, their evidence reviewed for potential DNA submission. In Heber City, life slowly resumed. The news trucks left, and the courthouse steps grew empty again. Yet the memory lingered. At the trailhead where Emily's car had been found, a wooden bench was placed overlooking the canyon. It bore a small brass plate that read, "For Emily Carter, forever found." That summer, on the anniversary of her disappearance, townspeople gathered there for the first time in nearly 20 years. Candles flickered against the mountain wind as her former students, now adults, laid flowers and small sketches she'd once encouraged them to make. For the Carters, and in cases like this, truth was the closest thing to peace anyone could ever hope for. By 2024, the story of Emily Carter's case had become more than a headline. It became a symbol of persistence, of what could happen when evidence was preserved, when investigators refused to let memory fade, and when new science met old determination. In the months following the sentencing, Detective Ruiz received letters from families across Utah, people who had lost sons, daughters and siblings years ago. Their cases shelved in cardboard boxes. Some wrote to thank her. Others pleaded for help. She made it her mission to advocate for those still waiting. With state funding newly approved, Ruiz was appointed to a cold case review task force in early 2024, a small team charged with identifying viable evidence for DNA retesting using forensic, genealogy and familial DNA searches, now legally permitted under Utah law following updated privacy guidelines in 2023. One of her first acts was to push for a digital cataloging system, a secure database of unsolved homicides prior to 2010, integrating case metadata, evidence status, and chain of custody tracking. By autumn 2024, that database was live. At a press conference in Salt Lake City, Ruiz stood at the podium. The same calm voice that had narrated 2 decades of silence. "We can't change what happened," she said, "but we can make sure what's left behind isn't lost again." For the Carter family, the attention was overwhelming at first. Reporters called, documentaries requested interviews, podcasts replayed the story under dramatic titles. But Linda Carter rarely spoke publicly after the sentencing. She declined most requests, saying simply, "We already told our story. Now we just want to live the rest of it." Instead, she poured her energy into something else. A scholarship fund in Emily's name at Utah Valley University, supporting art and design students who used their work for community projects. The fund grew quietly, fueled by small donations from people who had followed the story online. Each spring, a new student received the Emily Carter Creative Vision Award, a simple framed certificate and a letter from Linda and Mark Carter. The letter always ended the same way. "Use your gift to see the world the way Emily did, with empathy." Meanwhile, in the Utah State Prison in Draper, Michael Gaines kept to himself. Prison records described him as a model inmate, quiet, cooperative, working maintenance shifts in the laundry. He rarely spoke about the case, never appealed his sentence. A chaplain who met with him once told a local reporter, "He talks about time a lot, how silence gets heavier when you can't escape it." By late 2024, Detective Ruiz decided to retire. She had served 28 years in law enforcement. On her last day, she drove back to Heber City and parked at the overlook where Emily's bench stood. She left a folded note there, just one line written in careful handwriting, "We kept the promise." That winter, snow blanketed the canyon again. The bench disappeared under a layer of white, as if nature itself paused the story for another season. But the impact of the case didn't fade. Across the country, more states were revisiting their cold case procedures. The National Institute of Justice published a 2024 report citing Emily Carter's case as an example of effective interagency cooperation, a model for combining local persistence with federal DNA resources. By 2025, Utah's Cold Case Task Force had re-examined over 300 unsolved files. At least 7 new cases were linked to potential suspects through genealogy tracing. Each one reignited hope for families who had once thought they'd been forgotten. In Heber City, the Carters' house remained on the same quiet street. A wind chime Emily had made in college still hung on the porch, faintly ringing in the dry mountain air. Mark had taken up woodworking again. Linda tended her garden. They didn't move away, though friends had urged them to. They said the mountains felt like the last place their daughter had seen. On the 20th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, May 2024, the local newspaper ran a front-page piece titled, "2 Decades Later, the Case That Changed Utah Justice." It detailed how one young woman's story reshaped investigative priorities, how public pressure had fueled funding for lab upgrades, and how cold cases once dismissed as unsolvable were now being revisited with compassion and science. At the end of the article, a quote from Linda Carter stood alone. "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about being seen, even when you're gone." That sentiment lingered far beyond the mountains of Heber City. It echoed through police training academies, courtrooms, and labs. A quiet reminder that persistence could outlast time. And for those who worked the case, the analysts, the officers, the volunteers who sorted through decades of evidence, it became something personal. They began to believe that no case was ever truly cold, just waiting for the right eyes to find the right clue. In the stillness of early 2025, Detective Ruiz, now retired, received a package at her small home near Provo. Inside was a simple photograph,